Welcome to Native Exiles, Alderwood Community Church's podcast, where we talk about following Jesus in the tension of being in the world, but not of it. We have a really special episode in store for you today. Our guest is Dr. Dan Allender. And if you're not familiar with Dr. Allender, he has done some great work that has really helped a lot of people in areas of trauma and shame. He's written some incredible marriage resources as well. I'd love to point you to The Intimate Mystery. Another of his books that you really should check out is called The Cry of the Soul. And we have an incredible conversation today that I think is really going to bless you. Let's jump into it. Well, Dan, welcome to Native Exiles. Thank you so much for being here.
Wyatt, Steve, delight to be with you both.
We're really excited for our conversation today. Our church is headed towards a marriage event, a relationship event called How We Love Weekend. And the reason we were drawn to the material that we're going to be going through is because it seems like there are so many marriage resources out there where they're giving you some tips, some tricks, some kind of things to implement, and many of them are helpful. I'm not against any of that, but I just have the feeling often that there's so much more depth behind the problems in our marriages and the reason why marriage is hard. And so How We Love is all about understanding the way we relate to people, and often how there's deep roots in that it goes back to how we were raised, the trauma in our past, and maybe things we're not even consciously aware of, but they affect our day-to-day interactions. And so we're excited about that. But the reason I'm so excited to talk about marriage and relationships with you is because I feel like that's really a strength of what you've contributed to this conversation as well, that not just given some tips and tricks, but really trying to get at the heart of some of the really deep soul level, heart level things going on in our own spiritual health and in our relationships. And so we're excited to talk about that. And Steve, I know you have a long history reading some of Dan's stuff and had a quote you wanted to share as we get started here.
Yeah, Dan, I really appreciated your book, The Intimate Mystery. And actually, at the end of the book, you had a quote, and it jumped off the page at me because this is not the kind of quote you read in most marriage books, especially evangelical Christian marriage books. I do a lot of weddings, and so this is really perfect for me. You talk about the fact, let me jump right into the quote here. As a lovely bride and a handsome groom stand before a well-dressed congregation after tens of thousands of dollars have been spent to make the day one to remember, no one wants to admit what is true. No matter how mature the bride and groom, they are about to plunge into a desert. And you go on to talk about, Dan, that it's not enough just to have tips and tricks. We all love some of the things we've learned from marriage books, marriage seminars, but why is it so much harder than just learning how to communicate or a few tips to intimacy? Why is it hard?
Well, let me just start with an obvious sentence, and that is that every marriage is unique. And in one sense, we're talking about marriage in a very generic sense, but I think this is true, generically, universally true, that every good marriage is a taste of heaven. Mm-hmm. But because it's a good marriage, it's also going to expose the reality that every one of us struggles with sin. And if we think of sin in the way that Jesus speaks about it, it's the intersection of lust and anger, or adultery and murder. So already what we're saying is, if you've escaped sin, you're going to have a great time. The only way that occurs is if you're in the presence of Jesus and you become as he is. So the reality is that my marriage, we are within days of our 46th anniversary. It's been a taste of heaven. It's also been a taste of hell. And that intersection opens the door to the reality that every marriage is stunningly beautiful, or at least it was at one point, but also broken, literally, until the passage of one into eternity. So that is a beginning to say that if we give up the naivete, the false innocence, that it's all going to work out, and begin to admit that part of the purpose of marriage is to expose the necessity of grace, the necessity of the work on the cross. So in that sense, every marriage is a context to expose and to know something of the glory of what it means to be forgiven.
I
Well, and
love
that
what you said there about grace, Dan, about how it's an opportunity and an invitation into grace, because most of us just want the tips. Most of us just want to go to a seminar, give me the 5 tips, I'll fix my wife, she'll be better, and we're all good to go. I don't need grace. I just need tips.
Yeah. Well, and tips and tricks. I've not heard that phrase quite put it that way, but watching my own adult son and daughter-in-law deal with a dog that they just got from the pound. Look, tips and tricks don't work with dogs. They're certainly not going to work with regard to a complex, stunningly beautiful, broken human being or a marriage. So
Yeah.
I'm all for some degree of tips with stalks and tricks with regard to so-called Halloween, but anything else, I don't think it's going to work.
Well, that reality that apart from sin, marriage is beautiful and a picture of heaven, but here on earth, you're marrying a sinner, you're a sinner. If you're, in beyond marriage, any of your close relationships, your friendships, your relationship with your parents, that sin matters. I think most believers are going to have no problem agreeing to that. But I think even when we agree to that idea, often it's still a pretty surface level concept that sin is a problem because I am destined to at some point do some sin against you and you will have to forgive me. And that's true. That's a reality of what's going on. But it's deeper than that as well, because not only is there the active sin that I may commit against my wife, there's also the accumulated effect of sin that I have carried with my whole story, my whole life, her whole story, her whole life, that impact how we see the world, how we see ourselves, how we see God. I mean, where do you see that playing out in marriages?
Oh, Wyatt, it's a great question. It almost takes that breath to be able to step back and say, look, we married the one we thought, even without thinking, we married the one we thought would redeem us, that would fill us, that would, in some sense, bring us wholeness. And part of the complexity is we don't even want to admit what's really deeply broken about us, about our family, and about our world as we step into marriage. And again, that's what good premarital counseling opens the door to addressing just input. Just a little, just a teeny bit. You got to be in it to be in a position where you begin to see it with a greater level of clarity. But go back to your such important sentence, and that is you bring all of your life into your marriage. And all of your life, let me go back to those two key words. You have struggled with lust, and we think of that, unfortunately, as primarily sexual. Mm-hmm. But it certainly includes, but lust is desire gone mad. It is that emptiness which we inherently know that there is a loneliness, there is a loss, there is an incompleteness, there is a hunger that we want to have filled. But when we feel that vulnerable, and we're going to come back to this word, I bet, quite a bit, when we feel vulnerable, we feel shame. And in that sense of, I feel empty, incomplete, and in that I feel shame, the response often is, I will find a way to fill my emptiness through, sex, drugs, and rock and roll, or through hard work, or through perfectionism, or actually even reading the Bible in 1 year. So you can attempt to fill your emptiness by deeply illegitimate means, but even by legitimate. And in that, all we can say is it won't take away the emptiness. It may assuage it, it may modify it, but it won't resolve it. And that's where we get angry. There's a part of us that is just angry at those who seem to keep us from having the fullness that we desire. So when Jesus ups the ante from the word lust and anger to the word adultery and murder, those are the reality of violations of essentially profound portions of the 10 Commandments. And when we, in one sense, violate that which God made us for, the inevitable response will be a sense of shame. And that shame, which is, in one sense, wildly legitimate, gets used to actually perpetuate even more harm against ourselves and others. I mean, one of the saddest verses I know in the Bible is Genesis 2:25. And they were naked, and they knew no shame. So that is literally the last verse before we enter into what we have called the fall, the nature of what comes as a result of sin. And that play of importance, that indeed the rest of Scripture is a living out of what shame brings into relationships, into our relationship with God, even into our relationship with ourselves. So that's what's got to be addressed. And oftentimes in marriage conferences, and frankly in marriage therapy, it is the most central base of conflict, yet so seldom ever addressed, the nature of sin and its relationship with shame.
Yeah, I mean, I'm really glad that you're bringing that up, because it is so seldom addressed, this idea of shame. And I think what's so profound that you're pointing out in Genesis 2:25 is that this idea of a state of experiencing no shame is a core foundational aspect of God's design for humanity, that he made us to be people who do not experience shame. And that's the whole problem of what sin brings into our experience today, is that now we experience all kinds of shame. Help people understand the category of shame a bit, because we don't talk about it very much, even in churches and from pulpits. I think for a lot of people, it's a new idea. We're familiar with guilt. We talk a lot about guilt, that if you commit a sin, that you are guilty of some infraction. And so maybe people might think that shame is primarily kind of feeling guilty, particularly of a big secret sin. If somebody's, secretly having an affair or secretly addicted to pornography, that there's shame that comes with that. But it's a much bigger idea than that. Help us understand it.
Well, let's just say that shame is always the experience of the eyes, the idea of exposure. And in that, something is being seen, which we either intuit or know is foul, something unlovely, non-beautiful, that which is toxic and dangerous. So the reality of there is something foul within me, when it's exposed, there is the anticipation of judgment. And so you've got those three words: exposure, foul, judge. And in that experience of being in a position where you are seen. I'm a motorcyclist. I was on my bike at a stop sign 2 ways. And I remember it was a stoplight. And I was I could tell that there was something slightly inhibiting my capacity for nasal breath. Hopefully this is not too grotesque for your listeners, but I began to remove it. Is that?
Yes, I understand.
I'm following.
And so I'll make it as pure as I can. I placed a protruded digit up a nasal orifice, and as I looked slightly to my right, there was a car, and the woman was there, and she was like this,
just staring wide-eyed.
Staring, and I mean, in a moment, I am just covered in shame. Look, as a motorcyclist, the one thing you never do at a stoplight is be the first off. You just take a second to make sure there's somebody going through. Not in this case. I slammed my helmet down and I took off quick. Now, if I had done what I just did, in my bathroom with nobody there, no shame whatsoever, no sense of exposure of something dark and with judgment. So the reality is we feel shame 1,000 times a day, but we cover it.
Mm.
We are good at being able to escape people or situations that might shame us, but we have more of this internal tools to shut down the experience. Mm-hmm. And it's important to hear that wherever there's shame, there's contempt. And contempt is this judgment, accusation of something degrading and horrible. So when I feel shame, I can do one of two things. I can turn my contempt against myself. I'm an idiot. What a jerk. Where's your keys? Why can't you put things in the same place 2 times in a row? Or I'm actually better at other-centered contempt. And that is, Becky, my wife, where did you put my keys? Can't you just leave? I know I'm a bit chaotic, but can't you just leave it when I put it somewhere? So accusations, even self-accusations, judgments, actually strangely relieves a sense of exposure. So when I blind you with other-centered contempt, or in some sense, I blind myself through my own self-accusations, there is a certain relief from that sense of exposure.
What I love about that story and the way that you're describing this is, for those who know the Genesis 3 story, I mean, it's exactly what's going on in Adam and Eve, right? They commit the sin of eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And as soon as they realize that that is going to be exposed because God is going to come, that's the shame. They go and hide to keep from being exposed. And that's exactly when the accusations come, when God finally gets them. You know, Adam's first accusation is, it was the woman that you gave me. And that pattern just plays itself all over the time in our life.
What you've just described is the essence of what needs to be addressed for a marriage to truly grow. We all hide, we all cover, and we all blame. You know, the woman you made, that is a theologically vicious statement against God. It's contempt. She gave me the fruit. Mm-hmm. An attack of Eve. And then this third phrase, my Old Testament friends tell me that in Hebrew syntax, the third phrase would be said very softly. The first, very loud. Second, not quite. Third, almost silent. Just like we use the word but. You did a great job today, but. Well, we know that grammar sets meaning. In the same way, Adam is essentially owning nothing. Yeah. He is blaming God and his wife for what he's virtually not responsible for. And that is, yeah, he did eat it. So when we see that shame gets handled by a form of defensiveness or justification or efforts to explain ourselves. So a lot of people are going to hear this and go, I don't feel shame. I don't feel shame daily. I don't feel it 1,000 times. And it's like, yeah, sure you don't, because you're so good at being defensive. You are so brilliant in your justifications, and you explain yourself to escape the exposure that's central. So as a marriage therapist, when I'm working with couples, the dilemma is people don't own shame, and they actually justify their contempt for themselves or for others or both. And when you begin to open the ground, so to speak, it is distressing, very distressing, but it should be, given Genesis 2:25. And I love the way you put it. We were meant to know no shame, none. And yet, because of the nature of our fallen condition, it's inevitable. And when I say daily, we are experiencing some potential shame every single day.
Dan, I feel like we've answered some of the question we started with, which is, why are tips and tricks not enough? And this shame thing seems to creep into all our marriages. And just being a good communicator or even forgiving the other person doesn't just eradicate the shame all of a sudden. I think a lot of times we associate shame, like you said, with maybe a husband who's addicted to pornography or someone's sexual past. but it seems like you don't necessarily have to have those egregious sins for shame to enter marriage. What are some ways that just like garden variety shame enters our marriages and we don't see it?
Well, let's just jump into one of the most central, and that is less than 17% of couples are able to talk about sexuality in a way that grows their intimacy versus, in one sense, hinders even more. So even being married for 5, 10, 20, 30, 40 years, even if you're having what you would call good sex, like, oh yeah, our sexuality is good, do you talk about it? No. Why would we talk about it? Well, you talk about vacations, you talk about what you're going to do for dinner, or you're going to talk about how things could grow with regard to, making decisions, but you don't talk about sex. How come? So when we begin to look at where are the major areas that exist for most couples, 70% of our struggles are about in-laws, children, finances, and sex. Here's a very important sentence that research basically takes us to. 70%, another 70% of our conflicts have no legitimate resolution.
I think we need to hear that again.
That hurts.
Because I think for almost all of us, I can speak for myself, whatever problem I have in my marriage, whatever conflicts, the hope is resolution, right? The hope is that we'll fix it. And so if you're saying most of those conflicts, there is no resolution to be had, I mean, where does that leave us?
Well, and what most couples settle for is some degree of compromise. We'll go to the Italian restaurant I want to go to tonight, and then you can take us to Thai the next time we go out. And I'm not saying that's a bad idea. The complication is that compromise doesn't resolve the core conflict. The core conflicts have to do with that far deeper reality of I'm hungry. And it's not just for Italian or Thai food. I'm hungry for what only heaven can bring. And you can't bring me heaven. You can bring me a taste of heaven. But also, as I said earlier, you're also going to bring me, at times, a taste of hell. How are we going to engage that no matter how good our relationship is, it's but a taste of the coming banquet? And often, sadly, a taste of what I'm never meant to ever have to consume or endure. So the ability to hold the tension of desire within the context of true knowing oneself and the other. How can you know oneself if you've not stepped into those deep waters of shame? How can you know your spouse unless you have stepped into those with a heart to, in one sense, grieve the heartache that I bring, that she brings into our relationship, but also honor that much of the shame structures of our life we didn't come to by a kind of choice in 8th grade. Hey, I think this is how I will handle. You brought this earlier, Wyatt, and that is we've all been harmed. I don't care how good a family. I don't care that you have the best mother and father ever on the earth. The reality is they are sinners, and their own lust and anger played itself out in relationship with you. Therefore, we've got shame scripts that have been set within us at an age literally of almost birth and beyond, that we don't generally have the integrity to actually know and address. I came from a family with significant mental illness. My wife comes from a harsh and angry family. Do you think just those two sentences doesn't bring complexity to our dealing with where we're going to go for vacation, let alone our sexuality? It does. And I can tell you, even though I'm a psychologist, with the presumption I ought to know better. The reality is I can see your face and life far better than I can see my own. So when I'm in the middle of a conflict with my wife, and she reminds me, you always had to tend to your fragile mother, and you're doing something like that now with me. At that moment, I don't look at her and go, oh, that is really helpful. So another way of saying it is I'm controlling with my efforts to help. Oh, that is not who I want to be. Thank you. Thank you for helping me see how my past harm, but also sin is playing out in our relationship. And I am so sad that I brought that into this conversation. That would be wonderful if that's my response. My response is, oh, yeah, right. And you, critical one who learned how to judge before you were even able to speak.
Yeah.
It doesn't go well. So we can learn how to say I messages, and they're all good versus you messages. But the core issue here is, can we come to our own internal script of shame? Not justify, not defend, not explain, but let our hearts have the opportunity to name, to face it, to, in some sense, not embrace in the sense of it's good, but hold it as truth. So that's what I understand confession from the Greek word homologao. Say the same thing. Name what's true. Until one, in one sense, has the ability to confess shame, it will never, ever be addressed just by the good desire to not have it show up.
It seems
That's
like
really
it's
helpful.
It seems like it's easier, Dan, to admit guilt in a sense than it is to admit shame.
Yeah.
If I'm guilty, I did something wrong, I won't do it again. It's in the past. If I feel shame, I feel like stained, like I'm less than, and it's just almost too overwhelming and painful to say that, even to the person we're supposed to trust most in the world.
Yeah. And this may be a slight bit controversial, but I don't believe there's something called guilt feelings. Guilt is an issue, in one sense, of judgment based on the issue of righteousness. Were you traveling at 35 miles an hour in a 25 mile per hour zone? Yes. And you got selected for a ticket. You're guilty. It is an objective clarity that provides the opportunity for appropriate consequences. And you can say, but other people got away with doing that. Why didn't I? Notice the shift, judgment to judgment. So what I'm saying is, when you feel guilty, really what you're feeling is contempt. You are feeling a form of self-contempt because of the shame of having been caught driving above the speed limit. And yet you're also going to not just feel guilty, you're going to feel like it's just not fair because there were cars in front of me going way faster. Oh, now we've got to shift from self-contempt to other-centered contempt. Well, the police are just trying to make money for their municipality, blah, blah, blah. All right, so let's go into capitalism and its intersection with regard to the economics of a municipality. But the bottom line is, you are guilty. Now, let's address what's required: vulnerability. Homologao, confess what's true. I am an adulterer. I'm a murderer. And let's just say I've had the privilege of marrying, officiating my 3 children's weddings. And I talked about lust and anger. And I said, look, nobody in most marriages, most ceremonies, want to talk about either of you as adulterers and murderers. But you asked me to marry you. I'm going to tell the truth. And at least on 2 of the occasions, I'm paying for the wedding. So I'm going to tell you.
That's good. That's really good. It seems to me like this is part of what makes marriage the context in which some of the hardest conflict arises and some of the most hurt, because that idea of vulnerability, of having the things that you feel shame about exposed to the light so that other people can see it. Most of us walk around all day, every day, doing a pretty good job of hiding that kind of stuff from other people. And especially even with a person we marry, while we're dating them, we do a pretty good job of hiding that kind of stuff often. Not everybody, thankfully, but I think most. And then you get married and you're just not able to do it anymore. Even if you're trying, the parts of yourself that you don't like, the parts of yourself that you feel shame about, your spouse just has a way of uncovering that. And so you're having to deal with some of these things, and you've been trying so hard not to have to deal with them in all your other relationships, and marriage is where it finally comes out. I mean, for folks that are in that right now and their eyes are being opened to it, I mean, what do you do when you find yourself in a marriage where conflict is arising, shame is driving you to level accusations and to have contempt, and I mean, if somebody's even realizing that's the marriage they're in today, what are some steps to take?
Well, let me take you back to what you covered so brilliantly before: hiding, covering, blaming. And that becomes maybe one of the most central questions that every couple has to ask. Do we really want to grow in Jesus?
Mm-hmm.
And I don't mean to be unkind, but I work with a lot of Christians who actually don't want to become like Jesus. Because the cost to become like Jesus, apparently, he says 7 times more. He says 7 times, and he says it more than any other statement. And that is, if you want to find your life, you have to lose it. So the question is, do you want to be like Jesus? Well, great. Then you got to be willing to lose your life. Now, I think there are a lot of meanings to that sentence, and I'm not trying to say this is the only meaning, but at least in our conversation, you got to be willing to tell the truth. And the truth about yourself first, because it's very clear you deal with the log in your own eye before you deal with the speck in the other. So will you deal with the reality is you have shame scripts from a long life history unique to you. So if you grew up with loving, good, strong Christian parents, you didn't escape shame. But if you grew up in a home that was more brutal, demeaning, abusive, of course you've got significant shame scripts. Can we tell the truth about our own internal world? And if we can't, then don't tell me you want to grow to be like Jesus. You want the comfort of eternity. Maybe you want the conformity of a conventional life, but you don't want Jesus. You want the Jesus that supports your empire, not the Jesus who subverts every empire to create the kingdom of God and the life of a soul, let alone a marriage, let alone a family, let alone a country. So that first question of, do you really want to be like Jesus? If so, you're going to go after the cancer that's keeping you and your marriage from being what God intends for it to be: shame.
Yeah.
So
I want to dig into that phrase that you're using of shame scripts, because I think when we talk about telling the truth, confessing, being vulnerable, the first category that comes to our mind often is confessing the sins that you have committed that maybe your spouse doesn't know about, which is, I would say, a part of this. But what shame scripts go beyond that? What do you mean when you say that?
Well, again, back to the way we have learned to hide. So back to those words. How did you learn to hide as a 3-year-old, an 8-year-old, a 12-year-old, a 20-year-old? And it's not going to be the same. Your life is an amazing, again, intersection of beauty and brokenness. So where you learn to hide will be very different than the way I hide. But how do you cover yourself? In that sense, what kind of clothes, metaphorical, what kind of clothes do you put on to present a particular image that keeps you from being seen? So tell me about, and again, I'm using a metaphor, but tell me about your jewelry. Tell me about your makeup. Tell me about the clothing you put on to cover yourself. We know you're hiding. How do you cover? And then how do you blame? And that sense of, I'm a very verbal person. And apparently moderately bright. So I can develop quickly language that will shut my wife down, who grew up in a family where there was incredible decibels of judgment. So she can feel within a millisecond when I'm about to pounce on her. And I'm more verbal than she is. And so I have used language as my hiding, covering meaning. I use a lot of intensity, language and intensity, to create a structure where she's at fault. Well, it's taken a lot of decades for her to basically expose that, I say nonsense, but it's worse than nonsense, that violation of love, that sin. And so being in a position where the two of us have developed over 46 years the ability to stop processes that are actually being driven by contempt. I mean, that's one of the core questions when you say, I really want to be like Jesus. The next sentence is, do you want to become more of a contempt-free marriage? And then that requires you to know that your way of living out contempt with me is different than mine with you. Can we name the nature of how we each hide, how we each cover, how we each blame? If so, then we've at least got that beginning point to be able to say, Jesus, we can't stop this on the basis of mere sin modification. We are desperate. We are desperate. We need your spirit. So this is the realm where in the naming and the grieving and honoring, there's a place, again, for us being able to pray together, to be able to read scripture together, to actually know more and more what it means to, when your brother sins against you or your spouse, what does it mean to confront? Yeah. And how to do so in a way that actually joins you together rather than divides you.
I think that's so profound. I mean, one of the ways I can see what you're talking about play out even in my own marriage or my own history, I grew up with parents that I would consider to be among the best in the world, like you said, and both love Jesus, both raised me to love Jesus. They're actually at church with us now, and it's been a really fun season to get to continue to be close, and they're watching our kids all the time. And so we have an amazing family. But one of the things that was unique about my parents and my family is that we didn't express a lot of emotion. We didn't talk with emotive words very often. And emotions never got out of control. My parents didn't cry in front of me. My dad, I mean, one of the most amazing things about my dad, he never yelled at me. I don't have a single memory of him yelling at me, even as a young kid. And so I adopted a lot of that and kind of take a lot of pride in being in control of not letting my emotions leak out, not yelling at people, not crying, all that kind of stuff. And so to me, that's just normal. And then I married Kate, and that's not as normal to her. And I mean, I think if she was honest, probably one of her disappointments in me is that I have a really hard time expressing emotion, talking about my emotion, saying anything emotive. And I certainly will tell her that I love her, but as far as being tapped into actually my emotions, it's hard for me. And as she has kind of asked more of me in that area of our marriage, I get the idea of that shame of not wanting my emotional life to be exposed, leading to contempt, because my initial reaction to her is, this is just who I am. Like, get over it. I mean, stop trying to make me something that I'm not. I'm sorry that I'm not what you want me to be, but like, that's your problem to deal with. You got to deal with it. And that is just an outpouring of me trying to not have to deal with shame, of trying to put the reason for this problem somewhere else. And what's interesting is that, I mean, I'd be wondering what you would say to this. I mean, sometimes shame is the direct result of sin, or at least the direct result of your sin, but sometimes it's not. I mean, I might, at least how I'm thinking right now, the idea that I have a hard time expressing emotion is not sin necessarily. It may be the result of sin, but it doesn't mean that it's not shame. And it doesn't mean that it doesn't need to be dealt with. I mean, how would you help me parse that?
Well, first, thank you. Thank you for putting words to some difficult matters. And certainly, I don't question that your mom and dad are delightful human beings. But the reality is you grew up to some degree in an emotional desert. And even your choice of the word leak is a word that bears is an interesting amount of contempt. So right there, you're in the position that we are, as children, we are harmed. But as children, we're also unwittingly choosing directions which indeed are harmful. So I'm not going to say to the 3-year-old, you're a sinner that deserves hell. Again, for one reason, it's not comprehensible. There is a truth to it, but it's not comprehensible. It'd be like shouting at your child in Russian if they don't speak Russian. So the reality is that your mom or dad or both brought something of their own history into their parenting. And that history does not bear the life of Jesus, the life of a passionate man or a passionate God who yells. I mean, I'll take you to a lot of places where it is very clear God is yelling. So the idea that you need to be under control, the issue is your emotional response needs to be commensurate to the engagement that you're in. So an absence of anger, when there is, in one sense, honoring of the other to bear anger, is a failure. It's wrong. It's sin. But in that sense, because it's so true of every one of us to some degree or the other, we want to cloud that and just say, well, it's just our person. It's just our personality. You can't ask me to not be who I am. And the response is, well, if you were fully redeemed, you'd be like the Father. You'd be like the Son. You'd be like the Spirit. And apparently, Jesus seemed to, shall we say, have a lot of liquidity with regard to his emotional life, that living in a particular emotional desert would not be true. So what I'd say is your parents failed. You're failing. And in that, is that a surprise? Like, oh my God, he's it'd be like, if they're evangelicals, they've owned the reality that to say you do not sin, you're a liar.
Yeah.
Okay. So scripture always puts us in a corner. And when we get in the corner, the question is, will there be enough humility that when your parents listen to this podcast, for them to be able to...
And they are listening. Yeah. So thank you.
So what will you do, Mom, that you created part of an emotional desert? Dad, your control over your anger. Now the question is, what's the story that brought you to having to be that kind of control?
Yeah.
Well,
I mean, to that point, with you talking about just being vulnerable, talking about it, confessing. I mean, we had a really cool moment maybe 6 months ago with my parents and my wife, Kate, just at a dinner talking about this very thing. And that was helpful to hear from them, their experience growing up as kids. And I mean, that was healing in a lot of ways.
You see, right there, naming. And in that sense, we don't normally think of naming as the word confession, but it is a kind of not confession like, oh, I'm wrong, I'm so sorry. It is, can we put words to the reality, going back to the shame script, of how we have been formed and therefore deformed. But that's the context to be reformed. And if we cannot be reformed, then we're ultimately saying the cross has truly no power.
Yeah. Yeah. I think back, we've been married, it'll be 10 years this summer. And, I think back 5 years ago, this idea of the shame that I felt about having my emotions exposed or being on the outside, as I think to where I was at in that, it wasn't that I was consciously trying to hide that. It was that I didn't even realize that was shame. I didn't even realize that was something to hide. I was believing the narrative that this just is who I am. It's not a moral thing at all. It's just the reality. And so how do we help people be able to expose their own shame to themselves so that they can actually be aware of it? I mean, how do you start there?
Yeah, it's a brilliant question, but I also want to go, I like your wife.
I do too. Yeah, I do too.
And Kate essentially allowed her own heartache, hurt, pain to be in some sense a gift given to you to invite you, but also expose you, but also honor you. She wouldn't be bringing that to you if she didn't believe that somehow deep within you, you really want Jesus more than you want just an easy so-called life. So in that sense, exposure always is this intersection between invitation. I'm inviting you to become who you claim you want to be, and honor. I believe in you. I believe in you. Now, when you're being accused out of contempt, no one will feel that. You won't, yeah, I mean, Becky and I had this terrible fight over a dish rag that apparently I didn't squeeze out sufficiently. And at one point, she literally, she's looking at me and she's like this, and she goes, like, are you afraid of dish rags? I'm like, what? First of all, I don't even know what you're talking about. And I'm like, what? And she goes, you never wring out the dish rag. And do you understand that it sort of collects even more bacteria as a result? And I'm like, oh, good Lord. This is the nature of our relationship, that you need to bring me this information. And she's like, she picks up immediately and she goes, well, I know your contempt well. Seriously, is that how you want to engage even this small conversation? And I'm like, yeah. Yeah. And she's like, I really want to give you something good. And it isn't really about the dish rag. It's about how you live with me in the home, particularly because you're here now over the last 3 years, way more than you've been in the other 40 some years of our marriage. And I'm like, oh, I can feel it in my body. Like, oh, she's inviting me to a conversation where, yes, goodness might come, but I'm going to be asked to bear humility. The humility of having somebody speak about me in a way in which they're inviting me to become even more who I claim I would wish to be. And that moment for most people, let alone most marriages, we never get a chance to even get there, because we're just parlaying in contempt, self-contempt to other-centered contempt, etc., and therefore never doing the work that you've allowed our conversation today to be about. Can we address the cancer of shame?
Dan, I have a specific question, and you've touched on it a little bit, but when contempt is present, kind of like you said, it's so toxic, it's almost impossible to enter the conversation. But what about when you, at your best moment, you've rehearsed it, you've prayed about it, and you want to tell your spouse, when you do this or say this, it makes me feel shame. How do you deliver that without making them feel ashamed? It's like shame just keeps growing in the process.
Absolutely. And that's why it's important to know that shame parallels all forms of trauma. That when you are in a conversation where there feels like shame is there or potentially there, some of the same, in one sense, neurological processes that happen with trauma occur when you're addressing shame. And to say it very quickly, fragmentation is one of the first effects of trauma. Our left frontal lobe essentially goes offline. Broca's area, which manages language, goes offline. And then what happens is what has served us to remain immune from all the foul feelings that are associated with shame, we get numb. So we fragment and we become distant, dissociated, numb, and we want to isolate. Those are the three components that occur virtually with all trauma: fragmentation, numbing, and isolation. So I need to know that in the moment where Becky is bringing up a dish rag, which in and of itself is more about how I engage in mostly what has been maritally her space, the kitchen, and she's watching me beginning to fragment. And she knows enough about trauma and about me to be able to say, if you need time to kind of bring yourself back together, I'm good. We can bring this up and talk about it 20 minutes from now, but we're going to talk about it. Meaning, I'm not going to, oh, no, you're fragmenting. We'll not talk about it. You know, when you do that, you're creating a DNZ, a demilitarized zone. And when you've got that ground that you can't address, who do you think fills that with seeds of destruction? The evil one. So wherever you can't talk, sex, children, finances, in-laws, and you avoid it because it creates conflict, i.e. shame and contempt, but because we love one another. No, that will divide you over. I mean, evil is so patient. It will work for decades to create that distance. So just the ability to come back and to be able to say, I am fragmenting. Even over something as silly as this dish rag, I'm feeling judged. And am I kind of, am I not kind of? And again, you can't assay that to know how much judgment, how much not. But for her to be able to say, I want to talk about this, but I want you to be with me, and not under your own judgment of me or of yourself. So she's dealing with my fragmentation. She's dealing with my distancing to numb. And she's also saying, it's okay for you to go be alone, go take a walk, but I want to talk about this. So our dish rag conversation opened up about 20 more. And not so much, again, just ways I don't handle her kitchen the way she would prefer. What it opened up was so much more. What does it mean as 70-year-olds that are together a whole lot more than we used to be? What it means for us to evolve and grow space and time, let alone each one's soul on behalf of the gospel. So it's been, shall we say, a multi-layered, complex conversation that continues to require us to know, as we're dealing with difficult topics that shouldn't look that difficult to the outsider, that we need to be tending to one another's fragmentation, to where we're defending and numbing, and where we're really cutting one another off and isolating. If we can do that work without the presumption that it has to get resolved, fine. I will never use a dish rag and leave it anything but dry, like, well, again, you see, you can be angry and resolve and actually do more harm.
Dan, this has been so helpful. Go ahead, Steve.
I was just going to ask if maybe we could take another hour, and I'll tell you how my super godly, amazing parents taught me to be totally conflict averse so that I can't do any of what Dan just said.
That sounds like a great sequel. Yeah. And I wish we could go on and on, but Dan, you've been so kind to give us your time, and we got to wrap things up. I know anyone who's married has their own example of the disreg conversation, or in a myriad of other things going on, some that seem trivial, some that everyone knows are very serious. And as we wrap up, I just wonder if you could close by giving a word to the people who are listening right now in all the different ways that they're experiencing shame and the effects of that, contempt, whether it's in marriage, whether it's dating, whether it's close relationships outside of that. What would you leave us with?
Just the deep, deep conviction that marriages can change, but the cost it feels far greater than the near-term benefit. But that sense of, I do not want to die and not have, in one sense, invested the deepest energy of my life in the one relationship that most reveals something of the work of Christ. So in that sense, having that intentionality of, I am so grateful that you're going to a marriage conference. Absolutely. I mean, that is crucial. Now, are you willing to do the kind of work that will open the door inevitably to good things, but at a high cost, with narrow benefits, at least initially, but with the promise that as you become more like Jesus, I mean, I'm an incredibly happily married man. I made one of the best decisions of my life to con my wife into marrying me by telling her that I wanted to do what she wanted to do, which was to hike the Appalachian Trail, when I didn't even know what the Appalachian Trail was.
That's good. Dan, so appreciated your time. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. My honor. May it be
Thanks,
well.
Dan.
Thank you, Steve.
Thanks again for joining us on Native Exiles. It's so encouraging when I hear from many of you who say, hey, I just listened to your latest podcast, checked you guys out. We really appreciate that you're joining us for this, and really appreciate Dr. Dan Allender being with us on this episode. It's a great pointer, a reminder for an event we're having February 24th, 25th, our How We Love weekend, where we're going to continue with this theme of why marriage is more than just tips, tricks, and techniques, learning about some of the things that are really going on in our soul. Tell your friends about the episode, about the event. Continue to follow and subscribe, and we will look forward to seeing you next time on Native Exiles.